Welcome, everyone. Welcome, faculty, students, listeners on the web, and the wider MIT community. My name is Antoinette Schoer. I'm the head of the finance department and a professor in finance here at Sloan. I'm really delighted to welcome you all to our public lecture and fireside chat of my colleague Andrew Lowe's new book on adaptive market. We're going to hear a very interesting talk and then a fireside chat between Andrew Lowe and Peltzman about his new book and all the insights. Let me introduce Andrew, even though, of course, in this context, Andrew really doesn't need much of an introduction. Andrew Lowe is the Charles and Susan Harris Professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management and Finance. But as you all know, Andrew is one of the most insightful and actually most influential financial economists of his generation. He has worked on many different aspects of finance. He has numerous award-winning papers. He has an award-winning textbook in econometrics, financial econometrics. He was also named one of the Time magazine 100 most influential people of the world. And to all of us, of course, he is our really, adored and insightful colleague who has taught us over the years how a true scientist thinks about finance and does research in finance and combines topics that often are very politicized and emotionally loaded with an approach that is driven by science and therefore is really about finding true insights rather than giving in to the fads of the moment. And the topic that he's going to talk about today is one of those topics that very often gets discussed in very, if you want, faddish ways. And so bringing science to the question of how markets work and how adaptive market works is really an issue that is first order in finance and very excited to hear about. So let us all introduce Andrew Lowe to this public lecture.
So I want to thank Antoinette for that very generous introduction. I'm sure that's the highlight of today's talk. I should probably stop. But I'm really grateful to her for organizing this event and suggesting that we do this. I also want to thank Kelly Nixon and Patsy Thompson for arranging the logistics. I'm also grateful to Paul Salmon for agreeing to participate in the discussion later on. Now, Paul has the rare attribute of being a journalist who's more articulate and knows more about economics than most of the subjects that he interviews, myself included. So I think that's going to be the most interesting part of this gathering. I have to tell you that I'm most grateful to all of you for being here today, because I know this is the last week of classes, and you're finishing your projects and assignments, preparing for final exams, and the faculty that are here are preparing to write the final exams. So, and many of you are going to be graduating. So I'm really grateful to all of you for making time in your busy schedules to be here. This is a bit of a graduation for me as well. And it's because I've been working on this book, one form or another, for the last 20 years. Now, that sounds a lot grander and impressive than it really is. It's just a function of age and a certain lack of imagination in working on a particular subject. I've been trying to understand and reconcile adaptive markets, efficient markets, with behavioral finance for a while. And it wasn't until I went through this really long process that I finally came to an answer that I was satisfied with, and I decided to write it down. And that really is how adaptive markets came to be. It starts off really when I was a graduate student and first took Bob Merton's 15401 or 415 at the time finance course, and realized that this is just the most fascinating subject and one that I want to devote my career to. And learning about efficient markets, it's a beautiful theory, and how all of it implies so many strong empirical relationships that we can actually test. And then, as an assistant professor, testing those relationships and finding them violated one after the other, and being very frustrated and disappointed and confused, then reading the behavioral finance literature, which is based upon the psychology literature, which is based upon the neuroscience literature, which eventually is based upon the evolutionary biology literature. And ultimately, I came to applying all of these ideas in a way that I think actually reconciles this two opposing schools of thought. And so the book is really a kind of a personal journey that I took in order to get from A to Z. And I really wanted to bring along readers to that same journey. Now, I have to say that when Antoinette first suggested this, I was very grateful, but I was also a bit reluctant because it seems kind of self-important and presumptuous to imagine that you would all want to share my personal journey. But the reason I thought that it might be of use is that I was a die-hard skeptic of all of these behavioral ideas and a staunch supporter of the idea that financial markets are absolutely the most efficient in the world, that prices fully reflect all available information. And it was only going through this process that I became convinced that there's a different way of looking at financial markets, and I thought that it might be useful for those same skeptics out there to follow the pathway and convince yourselves. The other reason I thought it would be useful is that I learned way before the financial crisis, but certainly during the financial crisis, that the financial system is comprised of many stakeholders, not just finance professionals, academics, students, and practitioners in finance, but people from Main Street as well as Wall Street. And they deserve an answer as to why the financial crisis happened and why their 401ks turned into 201ks overnight. And so the book is also for them. It's to explain to them in terms that I hope they'll be able to appreciate what the underlying causes of these issues are and what we might be able to do about them. Now, anybody who's ever written a book knows that this is a labor of love with an emphasis on labor. And we just celebrated Mother's Day yesterday. So for those of you mothers who went through labor, and in many cases painfully and over a long process, and for those of us who were forced to watch you go through labor, we can attest to the fact that labor is often a messy, scary, dangerous, wonderful miracle. And that's very much how I feel about this book, that it's been a long process, and I'm really proud and excited and honored to share little bits of it with you. So what I want to do is explain a little bit at the outset, the timing of the book. As I mentioned, it took about 2 decades. Part of that was because of the financial crisis. So this book was actually due on April the 15th, 2008. That was the, this is actually from my contract. And it says here that the time of delivery being of the essence. But of course, something happened in 2008, right? And the financial crisis ended up being a very important set of events for the theory because it provided a lot of case studies and a lot of interesting angles that I hadn't even thought about applying my theory to until that time. And over the course of the last 8 or 9 years, I've actually spent a great deal of time studying systemic risk. Some of you have been forced to listen to my lectures in class about that, so you'll know that this was really part of this research agenda that I had. The other thing that this contract says is that the book was supposed to be 80,000 words. And in fact, the book is 150,000 words. And interestingly, the contract says we reserve the right to reject the manuscript if the manuscript exceeds this limit. And so I'm very grateful to my publisher, Princeton University Press, for not rejecting it. The reason I think it took that long is that my publisher told me early on that every equation you include in the book will reduce your readership by half. and so he said, if you want people to read it, you really have to bring it to a broader level. So I'm proud to say there's not a single equation in the book, which is why it's 500 pages long. And just to tell you that I really made an effort, the previous book that relates to the same issue, this non-random walk down Wall Street that I published in 1999 that summarizes the evidence against the random walk, which is how I got down this path. Here's a sample of a page. And there are so many equations in this book that I think the only person who actually bought it was my mother. And by the way, to give you a sense of just how few readers this book has, the publisher decided years ago to post the entire manuscript online for free. So you can all download it. Don't bother buying it. And when I asked him about that, doesn't this cut into our sales? He said, oh, don't worry about it. It's okay. All right. So, the financial crisis highlighted the fact that there is still this huge gulf between the idea that markets work well, that prices truly reflect fundamental value, versus all of the evidence to the contrary, that people are irrational. We make mistakes in how we think about investing. And I have to tell you that I took these two different schools of thought quite personally because I believed in efficient markets. But at the same time, when you read the psychology and neuroscience literature, it's clear that we all engage in these kinds of biases. And so after a while, it sort of felt like a kid listening to your parents arguing. And you love both of them, and you just wish they would stop fighting and get along. And that's really why it took me these 2 decades to reconcile these two parents that I love a great deal. And I think through the adaptive markets perspective, we can bring them together. So that's the most complicated diagram I have today. So what I'd like to do in the spirit of describing to you the main features of the book, I'm going to summarize it and then go through just a couple of examples and then turn to the fireside chat with Paul. So the basic summary of adaptive markets is that the traditional investment framework is flawed. It's not wrong, but it's incomplete. And it's incomplete in the sense that as market conditions change, the traditional relationships that we derive from the efficient markets perspective may not hold during those transitional periods. When you have a stable environment, then stable investment policies work just fine. And actually, for a period of 6 or 7 decades, you can take a look at the data and you can see that the efficient markets hypothesis actually did investors very well. And it's that environment that gave rise to things like derivatives, to mutual funds, passive investing, many of the things that we take for granted but have made investors much, much better off. The problem is that when the environment changes, and when it changes rapidly, then those traditional relationships and policies don't work. And so we need to think about an alternative. And that's really what the adaptive markets hypothesis tries to do. The current environment happens to be highly dynamic. And so if there's a message to the book, it's that we need to adapt to those changing market conditions. And you know how politicians are fond of saying it's the economy, stupid? I actually think that biologists ought to be telling us economists, you know what? It's the environment that matters. And we don't pay attention nearly as much to the environment as we do to the actors in the environment. But sometimes the environment can actually tell us a lot about what to expect. And so the adaptive markets hypothesis is really a framework for thinking about these issues in a dynamic setting, focusing on investing, risk management, financial regulation, and I will argue life itself. So it's a good way to live your life if you think about it in the way that I do. So I won't take too much time and draw out the detailed financial implications because I know this is a public lecture and there are people here that may not have a finance background and may not be interested in a finance background. But for those of you who are, you can compare side by side what efficient markets says about financial institutions and products and services and see what adaptive markets says instead. The long-only constraint, diversifying across stocks and bonds, market cap-weighted indexes, those are all implications of the efficient markets framework. And as I said, they're not wrong, but during certain periods, those kinds of products and services may not do investors well. On the other hand, in an adaptive setting, you can actually see that it generalizes to a great extent some of the things that we've learned in efficient markets, replacing them with broader and in many cases more flexible financial products and services. Probably the most important message to take away, though, is that while John Maynard Keynes may be right that in the long run we're all dead, we have to make sure that in the short run we don't get killed first. And that's really the point of adaptive markets, is to be able to adapt to the short run so that we can actually reach the long run. So what I'm going to do now is to turn to a few examples that highlight these basic ideas, mostly non-financial examples, because, as I said, I want to communicate to a broader audience and give you all a sense of how this idea might work. And I'm going to start by bringing you to Kerala, India. This is a particular state in India on the southwest tip, and it's a part of India that's apparently beautiful. I've never been there, but a number of people here might be from that region. It's got about 590 kilometers of coastline facing the Arabian Sea. And so you might expect that in this population of 35 million residents, that fishing is a pretty important activity. And in fact, there are about 1 million residents of Kerala that are engaged in fishing. Now, most of the fishing happens not through these big trawlers, but rather through small fishing boats. 15, 20, 30 people go out in the morning around 5 a.m. They spend 3 hours fishing, and they bring the fish back to the beach markets that are dotted along the coast. And because most of these fishing boats don't have any refrigeration, some of them may have ice cubes or ice blocks that they bring along, but the vast majority of them don't have any refrigeration, they will bring the fish to a particular point on the beach and sell them at beach auction at that particular market. Now, the challenge when they come back is to figure out where to sell the fish, which market to go to, because they have a choice. Once they go out on the sea, they actually can come back at various different points. And depending on where they land, either they will do really well if there aren't other fishing boats that had come earlier to sell the fish, or they'll do really poorly if there's a glut of fish because other fishing boats have come to the same point. And in the mid-1990s, there wasn't an easy way for these small fishing boats to communicate with shore, because they would go far enough out that you couldn't just signal to your business colleagues on shore as to whether or not the fish market was going well and the prices were high, or that there was a glut and the prices were low. In 2007, an economist by the name of Robert Jensen published a really remarkable study where he actually looked at what happened to the prices of fish in these markets before and after a particular technological innovation. What this individual, Swenson, did was to measure the prices of fish at these various different fish markets starting in 1997. And he measured that all the way through 2001 because during that period of time, cell phones were introduced to this particular region. And as that cell phone coverage was introduced, people in the boats could actually communicate with their colleagues on shore and figure out what the supply and demand of fish were, and then decide where they would want to bring their haul. So you can see that this chart on the left, this chart, get this, on the left, shows the 3 different regions of Kerala, India, where cell phone coverage was introduced year after year. And on the right-hand side is a graph of a survey that this author did of the local fishermen to see what the rate of cell phone adoption was among those fishermen over time. And so you can see that cell phone coverage was introduced into that top region first, then the middle region second, and the lower region third over time. And over time, you can see that the take-up of cell phones increased as they became more affordable and as the fishermen started making use of them. The question is, what do you think happened to the prices of fish during that period of time? Now, beforehand, these fish, the prices of fish would go up and down depending on whether or not there was fish already at the market when these fishermen came in. And it turns out that in some cases, tremendously large hauls of fish were just led to rot and waste because there's no refrigeration, and you can't, by the time you get to the one fish market, if you had to go to another one on another beach, that fish would spoil. And so it was a very inefficient system. These are the prices of fish in these different beach markets before and after cell phone coverage was introduced. That's what the black vertical line indicates. It's when cell phone coverage was introduced. You notice anything unusual about this graph? Before cell phone coverage was introduced, prices were extremely volatile, a lot of waste, and a lot of uncertainty about whether or not you were going to get paid for your day's labor. After cell phone coverage was introduced, zero waste, lower volatility in prices, higher profits for fishermen, and lower cost for consumers. Everybody wins. So this is an example of a market that's changed. So if I were to ask you to just look at the data and you tell me, is this market efficient or is it inefficient? Well, the first question you need to ask me is, when? As of when? And that's not a question that we usually ask when we do our asset pricing tests of market efficiency. It is now. It's becoming more popular because people are realizing that markets are not stationary. Markets adapt. So this is a pretty clear illustration of adaptive markets that comes out of the middle of the book. But I take some time to get there because, of course, markets are inanimate objects. They don't actually adapt. What's adapting is people. So I want to give you a couple of examples of how markets adapt through the actions of their individuals. And this is what really takes up the first half of the book. I want to study individual behavior from the ground up. So to do that, I'm going to use two simple examples. The first has to do with a paper that was published in 1975 by University of Chicago economist Sam Peltzman. Now, the paper has a rather boring title, The Effects of Automobile Safety Regulation, yawn. But in fact, this was an incredibly controversial paper when it first came out. Let me tell you what it says. So in the 1970s, the automobile industry faced a number of new regulations where the various different regulators said that they had to install mandatory safety devices into their cars. Things like reinforced bumpers or collapsible steering columns, seat belts, airbags. Well, airbags came later, but a number of innovations that would make you safer in your vehicle. And these are very expensive. And to force all consumers to pay for them, because obviously the automobile manufacturers just raise the prices, seems pretty burdensome. And so Peltzman, as a good Chicago economist he was, said, let's measure how much better off consumers are because of these safety devices. Let's measure how many lives have been saved because of these safety measures. So he measured them. And what he found was absolutely shocking. He found that there were no lives saved. But that's not all he found, and that's not quite right. What he found was initially, the year after these safety devices were introduced, the number of automobile occupant deaths did go down. And then 2 or 3 years later, it went right back up to where it was before. And this happened several times. There was only one instance where actually there seemed to be a permanent decrease in the number of automobile occupant deaths. But it turns out in that one case, it was offset by the number of pedestrian deaths that increased afterwards. So his conclusion was that once you have these safety devices installed, people drove more recklessly because they felt safer. They were used to taking a certain level of risk. You bring the risk down, they're willing to bring it back up in order to get to work a little bit faster. And this kind of risk homeostasis hypothesis became this incredibly controversial principle that was then tested time and again with various different papers. People argue, well, wait a minute, you didn't measure the kind of driving. Was it highway or was it rural? You didn't measure the people who were driving. Were they commuters or were they vacation drivers? You didn't measure the time of day. Was it during the weekdays or the weekends? You didn't measure the education level of the drivers. And so a number of studies were done afterwards to contest this idea. And it was a very controversial one, as you can imagine. It fits very well with the Chicago school of laissez-faire libertarianism. In fact, Peltzman said, if you want people to drive safer, you shouldn't put safety devices in the cars. You should strip them all out and put sharp spikes on the dashboards. Then they'll drive very safe. It wasn't until 2007 that a couple of economists did one final study that I think is absolutely definitive, that finally settled this idea of whether the Peltzman effect exists or not. And that one context is a situation where they've managed to control for all of these other factors, education, income levels, the particular nature of the driving circumstances, where the only thing that mattered was getting to your destination a little bit sooner. Anybody know what that context might be? Any guesses? Yeah, what would you guess?
Race driving?
Very good. Race car driving, NASCAR. It turns out that NASCAR had been facing a problem because every time they introduced a safety device, like titanium reinforced struts on their race cars, the number of deaths would go up. Because if you tell a race car driver that he or she is driving a safer car, you bet they're going to take more chances and ultimately end up getting hurt. We adapt to various different conditions, and in some cases, that adaptation can be counterproductive, particularly if what we think is a lower risk actually is the same risk. It just happens to be a sequence of good draws. We haven't had an accident. So just because we adapt, it doesn't mean we're necessarily getting better and better. It just means we're adapting. And in some cases, that can have surprising consequences. Now, this is a very narrow kind of adaptation, and it focuses on really just one particular context. The fact is that we actually engage in multiple contexts of adaptation, and that involves collecting data. And so I want to give you an example of how sophisticated we are at collecting and processing data. And this is really where computer science and neuroscience come together, and why we have to bring those elements in the book. So I'm showing you an illustration here with some various different colored blocks. Does anybody know what this is? Can tell me what this is? No? Some nice colored blocks, right? Pleasing pattern. Anything else? Anybody recognize this? Well, let me show you a different version of this. How about that? What is that? It's the same illustration, but now with a little bit less granularity. Anybody tell me what this is? You recognize this? What? Camera? A zoom of what? What is that? Yes? A selfie of me? This looks like me? I'm really insulted. In fact, George, you're right. Let me show you a high-res version of this. This is me being stalked by a ninja. Now, it's not actually a real ninja. This is at the Washington, D.C. International Spy Museum. But it could have been a real ninja if I didn't have this high-resolution picture. We need high resolution as an adaptive advantage to make sure that we are not threatened. So if it really was a ninja, I would know exactly what to do in counterattacking versus smiling for this selfie. This is an example of adaptation. The original machine learning tool that existed in the world is not Google. It's Homo sapiens. We engage in this kind of data science all the time by collecting data and processing it. And the more resolution we have, the finer the grain of what we're measuring, the more we can make intelligent decisions. So I'm going to give you an example of how we do this. And it has to do with characteristics of different people that we meet. Imagine you're at a cocktail party and you strike up a conversation with somebody and you just talk about various different aspects of his or her background. So let me just give you a list of different things that you might find out in the course of that casual conversation. Gender and sexual orientation. Let's say that there are two genders, male and female. Sexual orientation, straight versus gay. So there are 4 possible choices there. Race, ethnicity, there's 4 possibilities there. Let's say that there are 4 age groups: teenager, young professional, middle age, and old. Current home state, there are 50 states in the United States, and so on and so forth. These are the kind of things that you might learn over the course of a 10 or 15-minute conversation, right? So I'm going to introduce you to 2 people at this cocktail party. The first person I want to introduce you to is Jose. Jose is a gay Latino male, young professional from California, no religious affiliation whatsoever, a Democrat, middle class with an MBA. That's Jose. A little bit later on, at the same cocktail party, you meet Julia. Julia is a heterosexual female, white, middle-aged from Texas, Christian, Republican, affluent, and has a BA. So I want to ask you a few questions about Jose and Julia based upon this information, okay? How many of you would say that Jose is a Trump supporter? How many of you would say that Julia might be a Trump supporter? Okay. If you were looking to hire somebody for your internet company, who do you think would be a better candidate? Jose for an internet company? Or Julia? Suppose you're trying to hire somebody to do a fundraiser for a particular cause, and you need to get somebody to help you plan that fundraiser. Who would be better at it? Julia? Raise your hand. Or Jose? Okay? And if someone were to cheat on his or her taxes, do you think that would be Jose or Julia? Wow. That's really amazing. I cannot believe how judgmental you people are. I mean, you know, you've met this person for 5 or 10 minutes, and you're making statements about what they would do, how they would act. If Julia or Jose were here today and they listened to you react, you know what they would say to you? They would say to you, how dare you? You do not know me. You may think you know me, but you don't know me. How can you possibly make these inferences? The sad fact is that these kinds of inferences, they work. They're not perfect, but they work to a better degree than random decision making. And we've learned this over many, many generations of cognition. In fact, what we're doing here with this exercise is filling out a photo with lots of different pixels. Each one of these characteristics, each combination of these particular personality types is a pixel. And what you're doing at a cocktail party, and in fact all the time, what you're doing is sorting people into different categories and then watching how they behave subsequent to your sorting and using that information to predict their behavior in other settings. This very, very simple exercise is actually incredibly refined. Do you know how many pixels there are in this list? If you do the combinatorics, it turns out that there are 345,600 possible different types. That's more pixels than a 640 by 480 photograph. And we do this instinctively. That can be good sometimes, because if you imagine this as a machine learning exercise where you're looking at features and trying to map features to outcomes and looking at the predictive accuracy, it turns out that these kinds of exercises have predictive accuracies, depending on the context, of anywhere from 60 to 95%. In some cases, we know that they have almost perfect 100% accuracy, as we've learned from Google. There's a reason why Google is as large as it is. You know what Google does? All they do is they sell targeted ads to various different advertisers so that they can actually reach the right demographic. Do you know how much Google made last year? Anybody know? $20 billion. That was their earnings. And their profitability, their margin is about 26%. So this is an incredibly profitable business because it works. It's not perfect, so there is a significant fraction of mistakes you will make, but for the most part, as a statistical basis, it gives you an advantage, and from an evolutionary perspective, that's why we engage in these activities. But it can have some very unfortunate consequences, like stereotypes, like racism, anti-Semitism, a bunch of isms, because we are innately all engaged in this activity. I'm not trying to justify it, I'm trying to explain it and figure out what we can do to deal with it. Now I want to give you one other example of how these kinds of machine learning tools and narratives in our brain affect our behavior. And to do this, I want to give you an example of something that I suspect many of you have done. So anybody recognize this photograph? Do you know what this is? Yeah, Harvard Square. How many people have been to Harvard Square? Okay. How many people have driven to Harvard Square? How many people have driven to Harvard Square, have not been able to find parking, and swear never ever to drive to Harvard Square again? Right. Well, I felt the same way, and I was complaining to a friend years ago about this, and she said, you know what, I have a technique that will allow you to find parking much more easily. I was really excited about this. I thought she was going to tell me a particular place in Harvard Square where you can always get parking, but no, that's not what she said. She gave me an algorithm. And okay, I like algorithms. And so I asked her what the algorithm was. And she said, well, here's what you do. When you're driving to Harvard Square, before you get to the square, just before you get to the square, pull over somewhere safe and do the following. Close your eyes. Take a deep breath and utter the following incantation. Rabbi Mahoney, Rabbi Mahoney, Rabbi Mahoney. And then go along to Harvard Square, and miraculously, you will find parking. Now, yeah, I'd laugh too, but I want you all to try this. I'm serious. I'm absolutely dead serious. This is not a joke. Try it, and if you're too embarrassed to try it, tell one of your friends or family members and have them try it, okay? It works. It really works. And, because there are so many times when I've pulled up, to a space and somebody gets it, the half-life of a parking space in Cambridge, particularly in Harvard Square, is like 0. So I've missed out on so many spaces. But when I tried this method, I actually got a space on my first try. And so it really bothered me, as you can imagine. And so I thought about it. I actually worked on this for quite some time to try to I actually measured, the amount of time I spent looking for parking before and after doing this method. I really tried to, and I never published it because it's too embarrassing to publish it. And it dawned on me as to why this works. You know why it works? It works because the incantation, the superstition, the very act of doing this, it changes my perspective. It changes my narrative, and therefore, when I change my narrative, by that I mean it changes the story that I see unfolding over the next few minutes. It changes the outcomes. So in particular, here's what I noticed. I noticed that when I engage in the incantations, I now expect a parking space. I don't expect it 100%, okay? I'm not a fool. I know that this is kind of weird and superstitious, but part of my brain actually expects it to happen. And so you know what I do? I drive slower. I look more carefully to see whether or not somebody's brake lights turn on as they're about to pull out. And I go down streets that I normally wouldn't because, you can never find anything there. But it turns out that now if I go down those streets, on occasion, I will luck into a space. And that luck would have never happened if my narrative were, don't bother going, you can never get a space in Harvard Square. So that's an example of how a narrative has the power to shape behavior and outcomes. And it's one of the most incredible gifts of Homo sapiens and one of the most terrible things that we've done in the name of all sorts of awful narratives. So I want to give you one more narrative that I experienced personally about how our beliefs can change our behavior. And it has to do with the stereotype. And the stereotype is that Asians are good at math. You know what I mean. Those of you who are Asian and those of you who are not, you know the stereotype. And I have to tell you that in my family, growing up in New York with an older brother and an older sister, that stereotype was absolutely true for them. When we came to the United States, I was 5 years old. My older brother was 12. My older sister was 10. They had gone through the Chinese school system in Taiwan. And when they came to the United States, they were 3 years ahead of everybody else in class because the way that you teach mathematics in Asia is different than in the United States. I, on the other hand, got the benefit of a US education. But I'm not going to blame the US educational system. It's a fantastic system, seriously. It turns out that when I was in elementary school, the bane of my existence was this. I look at this, and my pulse increases. I start breaking out into a cold sweat. I get really nervous because it turns out that I had math anxiety, and I didn't know it at the time, but I had a condition that is the mathematical equivalent of dyslexia. It's called dyscalculia. And it means that you have a hard time with numbers. In fact, I have a terrible time with multiplication. I could not, for the life of me, remember multiplication tables. And it got to the point where, in second grade, the teacher, who meant well, wrote a note to my mother saying that your son may be mentally retarded. Now, we laugh at that, and then we realize how horrible that is. But you know what? That's the term of art in those days. I actually looked it up. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders back in 1968 actually did not have a section on learning disorders like dyslexia or dyscalculia. What it had was a section on learning disorders, and the particular term of art was mental retardation. Depending on your IQ, you'd be mildly mentally retarded, moderately mentally retarded, or severely mentally retarded. I wasn't severely mentally retarded, but somewhere along the line of mild and moderate. Now, my mother rejected this out of hand because, well, for one thing, she knew that I was way too good at arguing with her to be actually retarded. And also, I did well in my other classes. For whatever reason, I just did not do well in math. So I was the actual opposite of all the Asian stereotypes that were out there. And it really, really bugged me. And so what happened during my educational years was something very unusual. When I hit 3rd grade, I happened to be in a class of an amazing 3rd grade teacher named Barbara Figler. This is at PS 13. It's a public school in Queens, New York. And she's one of these teachers that we all dream about. She actually loves her students, and you can see it, you can feel it in the classes that she teaches and how she deals with the students. And so she knew that I had trouble in mathematics, but that I did well in my other subjects. And in particular, that I had an interest in science because I would go to the library once a week, and I would always take out a whole stack of science books. And so she actually encouraged me, and at one point appointed me to be class scientist. Now, I didn't realize that there was such a position. I certainly didn't apply for it. But she somehow made me class scientist. And what that meant was this. The privileges of class scientist was that I got to present my experiments to the class once a week. Now, we all had show and tell, and so everybody does various different things. But she said to me specifically, I'll give you some time, at the end of class, you can work on these projects in the back of the room, and once a week you could present to the class. And I was just so proud of being given that appointment that, the only thing that compares to that is when I got tenure here at MIT. I'm serious. I'm serious. And I even remember one of the experiments that I did. Did you know that if you took a lemon, wires, a compass, and a pair of scissors, you can actually construct a galvanometer and show current going through using the compass? I mean, this was a really cool thing. Nowadays, it's not very impressive with all of Lego Mindstorms and things like that. But back in 1968, it was fantastic. And so I thrived in her class. Now, I wish I could tell you that I was a fantastic math student afterwards, but I wasn't. I struggled dearly with mathematics pretty much until I reached high school. And Mrs. Figler, she didn't just pass me. She gave me whatever grade I deserved on my math homework. And so I had to work at it. She didn't tell me that I was better than I was, but she encouraged me in the things that I was good at and I was interested in. And so I actually ended up doing math as best I could because I wanted to do science, and I was told that if you want to do science, you need math. Something wonderful happened, though, when I got to high school. When I got to high school, it turns out that that was the years that New York City and the state was experimenting with this thing called new math. You may have heard about it, mainly because it was an abject failure. It was a terrible idea. It was an idea developed by a bunch of mathematicians to take away algebra, geometry, and trigonometry, and replace it with abstract mathematical concepts. So this is the book that we actually used in that unified modern mathematics. And the first set of topics was the finite number system, clock arithmetic, and we talked about groups, rings, and fields, and various kinds of isometries and transformations in 3 space. This was in 9th grade. It turns out that I loved it, and I thrived in this environment because they took away numbers. Abstract concepts were no problem for me. And literally overnight, I went from a C student in math to an A student. In fact, at the end of that year, I wrote a paper. I wrote a mathematics paper titled Transformation Geometry in 3 Space. Here's the table of contents. And I'll show you a page from it. You can see that even back then I loved equations, and I put them out. Not bad for a student that was diagnosed as mentally retarded a few years ago. And I got to tell you that this was amazing. I realized, gee, this is what it means to be an Asian, huh? Wow, now I understand what the stereotype is about. Now, a lot of people brought me to that point, obviously. My family, my teachers in high school and middle school. But it was really that third grade teacher, Mrs. Barbara Ficalora, that believed in me, that changed my narrative about myself, and that narrative actually changed the course of my life. When I got tenure at MIT, I wrote her a letter to let her know about this and to thank her. But I didn't know where she lived, and apparently she wasn't teaching any longer. So I sent a letter to PS13. They sent it back to me saying, you know, Mrs. Figler no longer works here. I sent a letter to the New York State Board of Education. They say, well, we have no forwarding address, and moreover, we couldn't give it to you anyway. And I called them up and I said, well, why can't you give me at least her last known address? And they said, well, because you know, we have a policy not to do that, given that many of the teachers receive death threats. Wow, death threats. But years passed, and in 2009, it turns out that we have this thing called the internet, right? And I said, gee, well, maybe I should try to Google Barbara Ficalora. That's not a really super common name. I actually have never run into anybody else named Barbara Ficalora. And I got a hit. And I called her up, and we got together. And it turns out that her other students from her third grade classes over the years have also kept in touch. How many third grade teachers do you know where the students keep in touch with them decades later? And a few years ago, we got together for a birthday party. There she is to my right, my left, turn around. And those two other girls on the right were actually in my class, Dorothy Levitt and Nuri Chaklahashi-Tamata. So it was an extraordinary opportunity for me to say thank you. And I would urge all of you who have your Barbara Ficaloras to say thanks to them for changing your narrative. And now, what I'd like to do, if you don't mind, is I'd like to introduce you to Mrs. Barbara Ficalora, who's here today. Thank you. Thank you. So I want to conclude and get to the interesting part of the discussion by just saying a few words to those of you who are graduating this year, because this is probably the last time I'm going to be able to say anything to you here at MIT. So I want to take the opportunity, first of all, to congratulate you, and also to say that I know that completing your degree program here at MIT must have also been a labor of love, with an emphasis on labor. But as you leave these hallowed halls out into the world, you're going to be faced with many other challenges. You'll be experiencing obstacles, setbacks, and even what you and others might call failures, but which I've learned to call motivation. And undoubtedly, you'll run into people, negative people, that will tell you that you are a failure, that you will never amount to anything, that you don't belong in this business or even in this industry. And you should listen to those people and learn what you can from them. But the only way that you are going to fail for sure is if you believe them, if you adopt their narrative for you. Because they don't know you. They may think they know you, but they do not know you, and they do not know what you're capable of when you're properly motivated. So I would urge you to draw upon your Mrs. Ficalora, and if you never had the privilege of having a Mrs. Ficalora in your life, then I hope you will draw positive energy from us here at MIT. I know I speak for all of the faculty and staff here in saying that we believe in you. We admitted you, we worked with you, we're about to confer degrees on you. We know each and every one of you is capable of changing the world for the better. And if that's not enough, then what I recommend you do is to close your eyes, take a deep breath, and say, MIT, 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 and you'll be just fine. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I guess we just learned, don't we wish we were all Asian? So let's change our narrative. No. So after this very inspiring first part of the talk, we're now going to come to the second part, which is a fireside chat between Andrew Lo and Paul Solman. Paul also is somebody who needs very little introduction, but I will anyway go ahead. Paul is an award-winning journalist who focuses on economics and finance journalism. He actually runs the series Making Sense on PBS that if you guys haven't seen, you should definitely do. It's a wonderful series that actually is focused on deep insights in economics. Paul, as I said, has too long of a career and too many awards that I can name them all, but just to highlight a few. He was a Nieman Fellow. He studied at Harvard Business School and afterwards was a professor there. He won 8 Emmys, 2 Peabodys, and a Loeb Award. And he's currently also a faculty member at Yale University in International Security Studies, in the International Security Studies program, where he's teaching in a grand strategy course. And so we are very delighted to have Paul here to talk to Andrew about this very interesting topic that we're all embarking on. Thank you.
Thanks. This is the first time I think I've ever been on a stage where I was crying before I got on. Thanks to you, Mrs. Figler. I was going to begin with you actually in this. It was that was just an amazing talk, Andy. Now, one thing, I have good news for you with regard to adaptability, because I looked it up while you were talking. The Peltzman effect peaked in 1975, and only with regard to total deaths, not deaths per passenger mile, which have been going down steadily. Kind of tapered off a little bit in the mid-70s, went down to, and the absolute deaths have gone down from 55,000 in 75 to 35, the low 30s, and only now have just gone up. And why is that?
Boston?
I don't think we have sufficient population to do that. It's because of, yeah, cell phones, right. So actually, even that market turns out to be adaptive. Now, he and I have known each other a long time, and I've been interviewing him, well, probably right since the late 90s, I think, when you wrote that first book. But one of the most striking things that you ever told me was a major adaptation of yours came after Mrs. Figler, came when you were at a lecture by Steven Pinker. You want to tell that story?
You know, it was actually a talk about religion. And it was a really fascinating discussion about religion through the ages and why we have religion. And of course, Steven Pinker is a very famous evolutionary biologist and evolutionary psychologist. He's talked and written eloquently about many of the ideas that are in my book. And one of the things that emerged from that conversation is the importance of self-awareness and sentience. In other words, the fact that we know we exist and we can talk about our own existence, and more importantly, we can talk about our own deaths. And for humans, where we exhibit emotions like fear and greed and love and hate, realizing that we are finite beings is an incredibly disturbing and scary thought. And so I think when Paul and I talked, it was actually after the cameras were supposed to be off, and you asked me about some of these things. I mentioned that I coined this phrase, existential vertigo. And
because you've been brought up, am I misremembering? You were brought up Catholic.
Catholic, that's right. And so, of course, the Catholics have very strong beliefs about what happens after death.
Just go on. It's
And-
better.
Right. And, it actually provides an enormous amount of comfort. And I'm not saying that God does or does not exist. This is not a religious statement. But the fact is that we do derive an enormous amount of comfort from knowing, or at least believing, that we go on. And that's also part of the narrative that is, I think, adaptive. This notion of dealing with this existential vertigo, the fact that we at some point realize we're finite is a terribly scary thing. We need to develop narratives to deal with that. So that one little phrase and that one interview that you did with me, Paul, I got more comments about that than any other interview I've ever done with any other journalist. So leave it to you to bring that out in our conversation.
Well, no, what was so striking was that I remember you describing leaving, it was in Harvard Square, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. And leaving Harvard Square and literally being almost dizzy, right?
Yeah. Right. It made me realize something about the Homo sapiens that I hadn't really fully appreciated. And it made a lot of things fall in place that, I didn't really understand. For one thing, religious extremism. It explained to me in a way that I could finally understand how it could possibly be that people are willing to kill for their beliefs. It's a very important and cherished set of narratives that people hold.
Another thing you once said to me, we were at lunch with a guy named Terry Burnham, whose thinking, I think, is in this book.
Yes.
In some sense. And he was asking, this guy was asking a question. He had been here, right? He was here as a student. Mm-hmm. And he was asking what he should do with his future, right? It was just the three of us. And your suggestion to him was he should consult a Ouija board.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And we both laughed because we thought, you're a funny guy, and it was yet another moment of Andrew Lowe mirth. And you said, just like you said about Rabbi Mahoney, you said, I'm dead serious.
Right.
You want to explain why?
Well, it's very much along the lines of this idea of narrative. So we all know the idea of a Rorschach test. It's like these random ink blots, and psychologists and psychiatrists ask patients to look at the ink blots and interpret them. And there's obviously nothing in the ink blots, but what's informative is what your mind does with that kind of randomness. So if you think about the Ouija board or the I Ching or astrology, all of these things are basically just random statements. I shouldn't say that for those people who really believe in these things, so I take it back.
I think you're relatively safe here.
Even if they are random statements, what's interesting is what we make of those statements, how we interpret them. So seriously, if you have questions about your career, what should you do? Should you take this offer or that offer? You can come ask some of your professors, and we'll do our best in giving our advice. But ultimately, what I think you might want to consider is consulting something like a Ouija board or I Ching or astrology, and then seeing what you make of it. Because in a way, your subconscious will have an extra channel to be able to provide your conscious with a new narrative. That's how I think these kinds of superstitions work. And actually, it's interesting. I have a theory about that, which I haven't tested, but given the forum and the nature of this occasion, happy to share it with you.
They're ready for any theory.
I know. I
mean,
see that.
Yeah.
So, have you ever noticed that certain athletes have these very strange superstitions? I notice this particularly in baseball. Yeah, I've watched basketball, football. Football, I don't see a lot of superstition. I mean, maybe with Tom Brady, you don't need any superstition. But with baseball, there's a lot of superstition. And I think I have a theory about that. And it's because when you have a sport where randomness plays a big role, and by randomness, I mean, batting averages. We know that batting averages are generally pretty low because pitchers are really good, even though batters are extremely talented. The fact is that even the most talented batter is not going to hit more than, 250 or 300. And so when there's that much randomness, you're looking for any narrative that can help you. And the way that I described to you, putting people in different pixels, doing these kind of feature extraction and forecasting, if you're forecasting random stuff, and it just turns out that when you do the sign of the cross, you hit a home run, you associate that with the particular outcome. And so the more random a sport, the more random the margin of success or failure, the more likely it is that you'll see superstitions rather than let's just get on with it and I'll see if I'm better than you are.
Let's go through the book as fast as we can. We only have 31 minutes here, and I have to go to the Celtics game tonight, so, so I'm out of here. My son-in-law is picking me up. But you got the father and the mother. So let's say the father, because you didn't specify, but the father is the efficient markets hypothesis. So why did you love the father?
Well, because the efficient markets hypothesis actually works really well much of the time. So in other words, while occasionally we can identify periods where investors freak out and the market goes nuts, for the most part, the efficient markets hypothesis is actually a pretty good approximation to much of reality. So from the 1930s to the 1990s, if you invested 60-40 stocks and bonds, you would have been very, very happy with the outcome. That would actually work pretty well. Passive investing is a wonderful thing. Vanguard just passed $4 trillion for a reason. It's because this idea of passive investing, of focusing on asset classes, managing risk and reward, thinking about how all of these different kinds of relationships are stable over time and how you deduce these kinds of optimal portfolios, that whole framework actually works. It's why I decided to go into finance. When Bob Merton taught these efficient frontiers, he wasn't just doing it for his own pleasure. This stuff actually is used and it works. But the problem is that it's not enough.
But we'll get to the not enough in a second. But I mean, you go into in the book you go into extol the virtues of the prediction markets, for example.
Right.
You use the term the wisdom of crowds.
Absolutely.
I mean, so expand or.
So there's tremendous amount of information that humans are able to process. As I said,
by the way, did you notice that the lighting is cycling like an inefficient market here? I'm a little concerned.
Mood
the VIX is going up on it.
So humans are incredibly good at collecting and processing information, all sorts of subtle kinds of information. In many ways, much better than computers, although that's changing, and it might one day change completely. And so when you think about one person deciding whether or not Microsoft is overvalued and Google is undervalued, that person may be brilliant, may be a fantastic stock picker. When you put together 1 million people doing this, all with disparate sources of information, you get some pretty amazing results. You get some extraordinarily refined information out of that process. That is the wisdom of crowds. It's a wonderful thing. Mm-hmm. So when you see it happening, and those of us who have been involved in financial markets, how well markets work and how competitive they are. They're not perfect, and if you've got a better mousetrap, you can actually do better in these markets, but you really need to work at it because there are a lot of smart people that are competing with each other.
So, okay, so there are lots of reasons to think of markets might be efficient, and they started out, Paul Samuelson, you credit right here in this building with having the first sort of formal insight into it, although he didn't publish it because...
Well, he didn't publish it because at one point he thought it was obvious and he didn't need to publish it. And then at some point, he thought it was wrong, and then again he thought it was obvious. And finally, he said, oh, what the heck, I'm going to just publish it. And it was an incredibly important paper. In fact, the title of the paper summarizes the entire insight. Proof that properly anticipated prices fluctuate randomly. That's it. That's, in a nutshell, what efficient markets was to me.
Mm-hmm. And so you start out and you talk about how you and a friend have a paper, a colleague have a paper, and you give this paper that shows that markets aren't efficient, that the variance doesn't follow. We don't have to go into the technicalities here. And how's the paper received?
Yeah, well, this was the test of the random walk hypothesis,
right,
which is a very special case of market efficiency. And when we wrote the paper, we didn't actually think that we were testing the efficient markets hypothesis. We thought we were writing an econometrics paper that illustrated how you use a particular statistical method. And so the data and results were really an afterthought. It was only after we ran the numbers and we saw that there was a huge discrepancy between what we found and what the random walk told you we were supposed to find that we ended up coming to the conclusion that stock market prices didn't follow random walks. We presented it at this conference, and we were absolutely roasted alive. It was embarrassing.
You do point out at this point that shouldn't be that surprising, because professors in testosterone ranking rank fourth behind NFL players, actors, doctors, and I just wanted to ask you, since I have you here, ahead of soldiers and policemen?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
Yep.
so there are all these testosterone finance professors in the room, and
typically with these conferences, you're assigned a discussant. This is a well-known scholar in the field who reads your paper and comments on it. And it's typically a very polite kind of an affair. They start off by saying, we really enjoyed the paper. It was a very interesting read, but, and you wait for that but, because that's when the knife goes into you. And the discussant said, but the authors must have made a programming error, because there's no way that markets could be so far away from the random walk. There's no possibility that that could happen.
because the profits would be
Profits would be
opportunities.
tremendous. I mean, yeah, you'd be able to make hundreds of millions of dollars if this were true.
Right.
Now, you can say a lot of things at a conference like this, but to call out somebody and say that they made a programming error is akin to calling their mother a four-letter word. Because there's no way you can respond. You can't, program online and show them that you didn't make an error. You could say, no, we didn't. Yes, you did. No, we didn't. Yes, you did.
Well, but you had run it from scratch 3 different times or something.
Craig McKinley, my co-author, and I, both of us were pretty good programmers, and we both ran the results 3 times each ourselves. So we actually checked this 6 times because we couldn't believe the numbers. And when we showed our colleagues, they couldn't believe the numbers. So we checked it before we went to the conference. But even so, this very well-known academic said, you've obviously made a programming error. And so, we basically had to slink away saying, no, we didn't. And, we were quite embarrassed, and we felt that that was pretty much the end of our career until other people went home and actually replicated our results. And they discovered that, in fact, the results were real.
So is this your epiphany for loving your mother? I mean, that is the behavioral economics side of the couple?
No, I was more like an abused child. I would still love the father, and just want to take me back. And I spent 10 years trying to explain away the results.
Is that right? Really?
Yeah. Well, at first we thought, well, maybe it's a measurement error. Maybe it's the fact that prices are denominated on eighths of a dollar, and that would give you certain kind of patterns. Maybe it's because prices were mismeasured at different times of the day, and so this non-synchronicity caused the results. Maybe it was transactions. We went through literally 10 years worth of research, and so the book in 1999, this Non-Random Walk Down Wall Street, that's a collection of all of our papers where we attempted to explain away these results, and at the end of the day, we couldn't. And so it wasn't until a few years, after the initial paper, we ran into a hedge fund manager who actually somehow knew not only my name, but he knew my paper. And he actually knew the equations in my paper. And I asked him how he knew this. And he said, oh, we've been trading it, and we've made hundreds of millions of dollars.
Did he cut you in? He pick up the tab anyway?
No, but he did buy me dinner. So.
Yeah, well, that's you would have thought that's the least he could do. So when did you become a mother's boy? That is a more behavioral than not.
Well, first of all, I should say that I'm not sure that the behavioral economists would call me one of their own, because
Yeah, when I first knew you, that's certainly not what you were.
Absolutely not. And I would have been quite insulted had you called me that. When I first started looking into the behavioral literature, I was actually quite a skeptic. In fact, I went into the literature thinking that I would be able to write a few papers that would debunk this kind of voodoo finance. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized that they actually had a point. And so I started trying to understand the why. And that's what frustrated me about the behavioral finance literature, and why I suspect I'm not particularly, part of their community. It's because they've documented a lot of anomalies, And psychologists in particular, they're fond of coming up with all sorts of theories that are mutually inconsistent. You know, they don't mind if on one day you're overconfident and another day you're underconfident, and that these two things don't necessarily explain a consistent kind of a personality. But from an economist's point of view, we like to have a theory that actually fits together. So I started asking why these behavioral anomalies exist. And that's how I got into evolutionary biology and neuroscience. I looked into the brain to see how do these decisions actually get made? Do we know what part of neurophysiology gives rise to it? And that's really what brought me to this notion that, you know what, behavior is really important, and traditional economic analysis only focuses on a portion of that behavior, but Homo sapiens is a lot broader than Homo economicus.
Before we get to that, what percentage of behavior does Homo economicus explain, do you think? I remember once having lunch here in this building with Rudy Dornbush, and he said, I was challenging him on economic, theory or something, and he said, 70%, it's good enough. Do you have a number?
Well, I have several numbers. And I think this is part of the adaptive markets hypothesis insight. There isn't a single number because it depends. It depends on the particular context. So I'll give you an example. For a hedge fund manager, trading during normal times, I think the percentage is 90%. For a retail investor, when the market's just gone down 30%, I think it's 2%. It depends on the context, and we all have the capability to be extraordinarily rational and extraordinarily emotional. And it depends on our environment. That's why I think we got to focus not on the individual, but on the environment. It's the environment that we ought to really study.
But so the next part of the book is after you have these two parents arguing with each other, it's look under the hood, right?
Right.
So and look under the hood means look inside the head.
Right.
And so you start the argument that gets you to adaptive markets by talking about what's really driving us. What are the non-rational aspects of what's driving us?
Yep, exactly.
And they are?
Fear and greed. I mean, plain and simple.
But you've got pain
emotional.
in there, right?
Pain is certainly part of that, absolutely. Pain is something that protects us. It's a very important physiological response, and those people that are incapable of feeling pain are actually at great risk of death because of that. And so, yeah, I believe that pain protects. And in many cases, when we anesthetize ourselves from pain, we risk actually some very bad consequences, which the financial crisis is one.
Well, you describe a woman in the book who, she had no fear. So you think fear is also very protective, right? I mean, for obvious reasons.
Right. Fear is the anticipation of pain. Once you've felt pain, you don't want to feel it again. So that's a very important memory that we have. And when you take apart the brain and realize how it works, it's really fascinating. You see that all of these pieces fit together in a very important way.
I mean, one of the things about this book, which I would, and I wouldn't say this if I didn't deeply believe it, I would recommend to anybody here, is that what he does is he takes famous examples from the psychology literature, but only famous to people who've been reading this stuff all their lives, basically, and one after another. And one of the examples you use is a woman who felt no fear because of a particular lesion in her amygdala, or building up a plaque, I guess it was. But, and so what happens to her?
Well, she was walking down the street, and she actually encounters somebody who starts to mug her, and she basically doesn't care. She's not afraid, and she fights the mugger, and she gets stabbed and hospitalized and nearly dies. And that's just, her approach to life. It's very dangerous. Fear protects. And so we have to keep in mind, and understand our fear, but in certain circumstances, it can be quite counterproductive.
And you give an example of the Flight 800, the TWA flight, and our collective, that is our government's reaction to that, and the reaction is a maladaptive response to what happened.
Yeah, there's nothing that says that adaptation is bringing us to a better outcome. I think that's one of the things that biologists, particularly evolutionary biologists, point out in Biology 101. Evolution is simply a process of elimination. That could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing, but it's just a thing. And you have to understand exactly what the forces are that are driving these kind of selective pressures.
And so what happened with Flight 800?
Well, obviously we thought that was some kind of a terrorist
People,
event.
they may not know what Flight 800 is.
TWA Flight 800 blew up, after takeoff, and somebody said that they thought they saw a rocket hit the flight, and ultimately tremendous amount of investigatory effort went into trying to piece it together. They actually reassembled all of the pieces of Flight 800, which, as you can imagine, is a pretty difficult thing to do. And ultimately, what was concluded is that it was a faulty mechanical aspect of the airplane, nothing to do with terrorism, but yet it really created this whole effort to prevent terrorism and the TSA and all of the activities that we now have to live with because of that false narrative.
But if we know now, if you know, and so many people know that there are all these behavioral anomalies and biases and so forth, and I can't imagine an educated person who hasn't learned about them and read them. Why does the efficient market hypothesis still have the grip it does? Robert Lucas, famous, people still in economics still believe Robert Lucas, and yet every central bank in the world pays no attention to his fundamental, brilliant insight, right?
Well, I can only quote Paul Samuelson here, who, paraphrasing Max Planck, said that science progresses funeral by funeral. And so maybe we need a few more funerals. I think that people are comfortable with their narrative. It's very difficult to change your worldview. In fact, I did not look to write this book, believe me. I was perfectly happy studying basic finance, doing financial econometrics, and I would have liked nothing more than for us to have found that the random walk hypothesis actually worked. And so it took 10 years for me to actually come to the conclusion that no, maybe this theory needs some updating. And I was dragged kicking and screaming to all of these other fields looking for the answer. So I think I was just stubborn, and that's sort of what drew me.
And you say here it takes a theory to beat a theory.
Mm-hmm.
So the adaptive markets theory comes from your understanding of behavioral economics, which then gets you inside the hood, right? Then fear, greed, pain. Then where do you go from that? Then you go to neuroscience because you're trying to figure out how that works.
Well, and then you have to ask the question, all right, why is the brain the way it is?
Yeah.
And the why, once again, brings you now to evolutionary biology, and you have to compare ourselves to other species and ask, were we always like this? Or did somehow evolution bring us these wonderful tools, these cognitive abilities? And then after you study the evolutionary biology of the brain, you then start to ask, well, how do you put it all together? And this is where artificial intelligence comes in. Suppose you had to program a human mind. How would you go about doing it? And that really forces you to make use of all of these different tools. And we have wonderful computer scientists here. Patrick Winston figures in this book because he actually highlights this notion of narrative. He calls it a story. We all have stories, and really true artificial intelligence is one that can actually tell new stories, develop new stories, new narratives on the fly. And I think that changes the way we think about AI today. It's very different than what AI was 20 years ago.
And the new story is the adaptation?
Yeah, it's being able to construct new stories as a function of market conditions and our environment to adapt that kind of narrative.
But why do you say, as you did in your talk, that things are so much more, the environment is changing so much more now than previously? I mean, the age of discovery, the Industrial Revolution, the Second Industrial Revolution, World War I, World War II. I mean, there are these huge upheavals in Western culture.
Right.
So
Why now?
What's different now? Yeah.
Well, so first of all, I didn't know if there was anything different now, and since I'm a data person, I like to measure stuff. So we can measure what's different now. So here are a few things that are different now. Today, we have about 7 billion people walking this planet. 100 years ago, the population of the world was 1.5 billion. So I would say that's a pretty big difference, right?
Mm-hmm. I'll give you that.
Second, today, we're a global economy. And that's not even true 20 years ago.
Well, in
That's a relatively-
1914, we were a pretty global economy.
Well, but let me give you an example of how global we are. You know, it used to be the case that if you want to buy a flat panel TV that's 50 inches back in, I don't know, 2005, that would have cost you about $10,000. And I know because I bought one in 2005. If you want to buy a
So
50
did I, actually.
Okay, so you know. If you want to buy a flat panel TV today, 50 inches, maybe it'll run you $800.
If that.
I mean, how is that possible that it's so cheap? Well, it's because we now no longer make the TVs in the US. We make them in Malaysia, Korea, China, India. And so competition has become extraordinary, much more so than in 1914. And we have a global economy not only for real assets, but also for financial assets. So, you know, what fueled the financial crisis was not just US investors. We had investors from France investing in mortgage-backed securities to provide loans to people in Stockton, California. That's different.
So if markets are adapting, is it that the markets aren't adapting fast enough that caused the crash of '08?
Well, it's a combination. I think that financial technology got way ahead of us. And we increased the sizes of these markets much faster than we could manage the leverage. So if you take a look at the amount of mortgage-related debt that we issued in 1995, that was about $450 billion in the US, that one year, 1995. If you fast forward to 2003, just 8 years later, we issued over $3 trillion of mortgage-related debt in that one year. That's an extraordinary increase over a very short period of time. And I would argue that the system did not have enough feedback loops to be able to adjust to that. We had anesthetized ourselves from the pain, partly through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Government guarantees are a form of anesthetic. You know, if you lose money, we will make you whole. You will feel no pain. That's not a good idea from the perspective of somebody who wants to protect themselves from loss.
That's the moral hazard problem that Peltzman supposedly found.
That's one example, yeah.
So we got ahead of ourselves. So that means, again, I'm trying to tie it to your thesis. We were not sufficiently adaptive to an environment or a narrative, sort of a financial narrative that we had created.
Well,
I mean,
well, you know, it depends.
what hope is there then that we're going to actually change?
So here I have to, again, bring back the evolutionary biologist statement. You're making pejorative statements about we were too slow, too fast. Imagine an ecologist that was asked to
it was you who said the technology got ahead of itself.
They got ahead of us, but I didn't say that was too fast or too slow. In other words, it got ahead of us, which means that we had a hard time adapting, but that just meant that there are some losers and some winners. You know, I would argue that, you know, somebody like John Paulson adapted just fine.
Yes.
And so that's the problem. It's that, you know, in any kind of an ecosystem, there are predators and there are prey. And unfortunately, most of us ended up being prey in the financial crisis. So from an ecological perspective, it's hard. I know it's hard to not make value judgments, but as a scientist, what we might want to do is to first study the ecosystem, measure all of the various different species and their biomasses, and look at their mating rituals and their behavior and how they interact. And
I don't want to know John Paulson's mating
Well,
rituals. Just saying. I know that might be judgmental, but
And once you actually map out all of these relationships, you can then decide what you want to do with that information. And that's where the policy comes in. So if the goal, I don't know what the goal is. So when you said, are we adapting too fast or too slow,
Right.
relative to what or for what end? If the goal is to create...
well, the fishermen of Kerala, we want not to be going like that, or certainly
Right.
not going like that.
Great.
So let's keep it on an even keel there.
Perfect. Now that you've told me that,
Yeah.
I can then tell you what needs to happen.
What happened? What needs to happen?
What needs to happen is that we need to have regulations that are adaptive. We need to have people feel pain when markets become too over-leveraged. And
Well, they did feel pain.
after the fact, not before the fact. It's a little too late to feel pain after you've already had the heart attack. you need to have the pain beforehand, so you stop eating red meat, start exercising, and watch your cholesterol, right?
Right.
We need that early warning. And when you anesthetize yourselves, that early warning is gone.
We have about 7 minutes left, and the real purpose of this book, it seems to me, is the theory to upend the theory of the past, to beat the theory of the past, takes a theory to beat a theory. But it's also about how hopeful you are with respect to what finance can do. And one of the things that I've been most struck by, as you know, we've talked about it a whole bunch and never have been able to do a story yet about it, but maybe this book would be the trigger for it, is your idea of financing cancer research. So in the remaining 6 minutes and 11 seconds, what are we moving towards? Are we past the era of the crashes like '08? Are we becoming so much more adaptive that we're going to get to your Star Trek economy, which you point out in the book? In Star Trek, there are no financial issues at all because they all seem to have been solved. And you figure it's by financial engineering, right?
I believe that, but
so does Bob.
I was taught by Professor Merton. So,
that's right.
But I would argue that Mrs. Figler also influenced me to have a positive attitude. She taught me persistence pays off, and I believe that. We're facing a lot of challenges, and I see the human race as having solved a large number of challenges already. That's why we're at 7 billion people now, as opposed to 1.5 billion. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the low-hanging fruit has been taken in terms of dealing with sanitation, food supplies. Not to say there isn't starvation around the world, there is, and I find it inexcusable because it doesn't need to happen. We have enough resources. But by and large, we've solved a lot of the easier problems. Mm-hmm. So what that means is what's left are the really big issues: climate change, energy, cancer, Alzheimer's. And for these kinds of issues, I know for a fact that it's not one brilliant person that's going to solve it for us. It's just too hard. And the human brain has not developed that quickly that one person can actually come up with solutions to all of these problems. We're going to need collective intelligence, wisdom of crowds. How do you
The President of the United States might take issue with what you're saying. I just want to point out.
I'm no politician, so I can't comment on that.
I'm just saying.
But if I were to ask you, how do you motivate the 100,000 smartest people in the world to drop what they're doing and help you focus on the issue that you care about? How do you do that? Mm-hmm. Maybe it's by goodwill. Maybe it's by appealing to their sense of fairness and equity. But I think that a better way to do it is financial engineering. Let's give them an incentive to do that because, look, we're all busy. We all have to worry about our families. We have to take care of our own. And why can't we use the financial system to do just that? Well, there isn't a reason why we can't do it. And Bob Merton invented the field of financial engineering and taught me all of these tools that we could be using. So let's use them. So
how do you use them with regard to cancer?
Well, from an outsider's perspective, it's easy, right? You got a bunch of projects that are each incredibly risky, very costly, they take a long time, and the probability of success is pretty low. What do? Stick them into a portfolio, and diversification will give you lower risk and better overall risk-adjusted rate of return.
CBS, cancer-backed securities.
Exactly, yeah. Now, I know that sounds crazy, and it was crazy until you start running the numbers, and when you look at the numbers, actually it's not so crazy. It looks pretty interesting.
Different tranches for different
tranches
for different levels
absolutely.
Of progress, whether it's startups.
We take all of the pages out of the playbook of the financial crisis and mortgage-backed securities, and we apply that to all of the social priorities. Because finance doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. If we don't let it, we can do well by doing good.
And you've been working on this for what, 3-4 years now?
More like 6 or 7. When a number of my friends and family started dealing with cancer, I realized that cancer patients need a financial economist about as much as a fish needs a 401k plan. But actually, we can actually contribute to this if we start developing some of these ideas.
And where are you on this project now? Because you've been having conferences for the last...
Conferences, we've had meetings with various different stakeholders, we've written a number of papers. So progress is actually moving along. Last year, UBS announced an oncology impact fund where they used a portfolio structure, raised $470 million for early stage cancer drug development. We had a rare disease company focusing on rare genetic disorders, BridgeBio Capital. They got funded with a number of venture capitalists and private equity firms. A company that I sit on the board of, Roivant Sciences, uses a portfolio approach. And I think they've got multiple drugs in the clinic already. So I think this idea of creating financial vehicles that spread the risk, it's certainly not a new idea, but I think in the biopharma space, there are new business models that are developing to take these ideas and implement them.
And do you think we're getting better? I mean, the cancer is something I think we could all relate to and say, oh my goodness, we're rooting for you. We'd be happy to buy shares at a modest price. Is this happening everywhere? I mean, are we moving towards this Star Trek future that you envision?
I think we are, but I think it would go a lot faster if people in this room actually got involved. And that's one of the reasons why I teach this stuff. What better forum than the world's best students to take these ideas out and implement them?
Last question. You talk in the book about hedge funds, and you say hedge funds are either the tip of the spear, showing us where to go, or the canary in the coal mine. So, last question, what are the hedge funds telling us right now?
Well, right now the hedge funds are struggling because they've gone through a pretty big seismic shift, not only with the financial crisis, but with the lack of leverage and the illiquidity that's emerged. So I think that many hedge funds are going out of business, but new hedge funds are forming, and they're developing a new narrative of how to develop strategies that are profitable in the new world. So this is why I call it the hedge funds the Galapagos Islands of finance. You can see evolution happening before your very eyes, and my guess is that the innovations that will come in the investment world will be coming from the hedge fund industry over the next few years.
And so we are evolving, we will evolve, there will be seismic changes in an environment, and then it'll be tough to deal with them because we'll be stuck with the paradigms of the past, but we'll do better and better?
Well, I'm hoping so, but that
no,
remains to be seen.
What do you think?
I think that there is a good chance we will, but there is some chance that we won't. There is some chance that an extinction event might occur, and the planet will be just fine, but Homo sapiens will be one of the cul-de-sacs of the evolutionary highway.
Well, that's a note on which existential vertigo should be back here for you all. And these are young people. Andrew Lo, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.